Royal Highness, Excellencies, Major General, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great honor for me to make a presentation about marine firefighting on overall, and especially to speak about the fire on board of a Conroe container vessel ship, the Atlantic Cartier, the big fire on board we had on the 1st and 2nd May last year. Before I speak about the incident itself and the results from this and the lessons learned, let me introduce shortly some information about the State Fire Department of the City of Hamburg, which I have the honor to represent here today. You see our tasks which are listed up here, and we have about 250,000 calls per year, and the most of them, of course, are belonging to the Emergency Medical Service, about 220,000 of them. There are roughly about 10,000 fires per year, and behind this system there are about 2,500 professional firemen, and again 2,500 part-time firemen. And the State Fire Department of the City of Hamburg is also responsible for any kind of incident in the harbor area in the city of Hamburg, as well as for ship firefighting in the harbor area and the River Elbe up to the coastline. The agenda of my presentation is first want to introduce some information about the Port of Hamburg itself, speak about the authorities and actors which are in charge in any kind of emergencies, and speak about a little bit of the emergency procedures as well. And then I want to introduce in the main part of the presentation the ship, the Atlantic Cartier, where the fire was on board. You see one of the pictures above. And then I want to show you the incident itself, and of course which conclusions have to be made as lessons learned from this incident last year. And I want to mention to this special vehicle down here. This is a remote-controlled, carriage-mounted fan, and we use this appliance and this thing inside the vessel to cool the system down, and it was very helpful to have this. Maybe mention it later during my presentation. Just some information about the Port of Hamburg itself. Maybe, as you know, the location of Hamburg in the area in the north of Germany is not located directly at the coastline. It is about 50 miles away from the coastline, so the ships have to go up the River Elbe, coming in the Port of Hamburg from this direction. And the city itself, which is located in this area, the city center you find here, has about 1.7 million people living there, and the free and Hanseatic city of Hamburg is one of the 16 states of the Federal Republic of Germany. So it's independent in itself and responsible for safety reasons and all these things. And the Port of Hamburg itself is close to the city center, as you can see, and the main terminals are in these areas here and over there. And the city center and a very new part of the city, the so-called harbor city, which is under construction right here, partly in use, is quite close to another terminal, which is in this area where the fire occurred in the 1st of May. The speciality is, and the most important for us, is that all the port area is in the main wind direction to the city center, so that any problem which we have in the port itself will or may impact the citizens in a few minutes later. So we are very aware of any kind of security aspects in this area. Well, who are the authorities and actors in any kind of emergency? The federal and the coastal state governments are interconnected via the CCME, the Central Command for Maritime Emergencies, which is in the city close to Hamburg, and there all events are managed in respect of firefighting or any other kind of emergency. And they run an assessment and coordination center down there, as well as operational structures for firefighting, medical rescue on the seaside, in the North Sea, in the Baltic Sea, as well on the rivers going up and down to the sea itself. And the CCME, the Central Command for Maritime Emergencies, take over the formal operational control upon determination of a complex emergency, and this fire was one of the complex emergencies. But if this happens in Hamburg itself, they handle over immediately to the State Fire Department of Hamburg to have the overall coordination and to be in charge of the incident. So it was made in this event where I speak about as well. Using the dangerous goods information system, it is very useful to find any kind of information about dangerous goods coming in and out the harbor. And all security agencies, even the control rooms of police and fire department, for example, have access to this information system, and they know at any time all incoming goods which are handled on the terminals as well as on the ships at least 24 hours ahead in advance, so that you can know exact the position, the storing position, the quantities, the kind of dangerous goods at any time everywhere in the harbor area, so that we already know in the alerting phase to any kind of incident, and the incident commander is given this information as well, which substances were located at which place on board, so we can react properly in the first time in the incident as well. And the water police is able to match these informations with the loading documents on board, so that we can verify it and make sure that every information is exactly and reliable. What are the responsibilities to work together in any kind of emergency in the port area? There is on the one hand side the Hamburg Port Authority and the Harbor Master, and they are general responsible for the whole port operations. And this is the regulatory authority. They say, okay, we stop the traffic, we do it in this way, the ships come in, go out, and they do the overall regulation of port operation, and they also can give advice to owners of ships, for example, to the terminal operators, to do things in a proper way. In any kind of emergency, if the Port Authority is not available in time, the police can take over for emergency regulatory procedures. And the State Fire Department, as one of the other players, is always the on-scene commander for any kind of emergency anywhere in the harbor. So it's up to us to do the overall coordination with all the players to keep the procedures in a good way. And the Ministry of Interior of the City of Hamburg, they are responsible for civil protection, and if you remember, I showed you the harbor of Hamburg is quite close to the city center, so the population might be affected quite soon. Then in case of an impact in the city, they take over the control for any kind of civil protection. Well, I just want to speak about the fire on board of the Atlantic Quartier. And if you remember the whole image of Google Earth from the port of Hamburg, we are now very close to the city center, which is now right here. This is part of the new harbor city. It's a very nice area which is developed now for living close to the waterfront. And on the 1st of May, up to the 5th of May last year, in Hamburg there was the 34th German Protestant Church Congress, and after the opening ceremony, about 350,000 people were celebrating a welcome evening in exactly this area. So there were lots of people in there, massive events, and quite close, only 1,000 meters away from there, on the other bank of the River Elbe. There was the terminal where they handle cars and rolling goods and containers as well. And it was there that on the 1st of May, the convoy vessel Atlantic Quartier was moored to be off and unloaded at the next day. So we had a big ship quite close to a massive event of people, different from the general direction of wind, which is in this way. On that day, we had a good situation. The wind was coming from the northeast and going away from the city center. So what is the ship itself? The Atlantic Quartier is 293 meter long and 33 meter wide Swedish ship with about 11 decks. It was built in 1985 and has a capacity of about 50,000 tons, and it can load half of the length of the ship, vehicles and rolling cargoes like a ferry. It's this part up to here, and it will be filled up over a ramp at the stern of the vessel. And in the front part, from here to there, it's just a classical container vessel and could carry containers inside as well as on the deck over the whole length of the ship. And for the car decks, the vessel has a stationary carbon dioxide extinguishing system and manually closing fire doors functioning as slide doors. They were installed there. And the crew of all, 26 men, and during the event, another 6 people were working on it from a ship repair company. The Atlantic Quartier came from Göteborg in Sweden to Hamburg. It does this regularly, and it's servicing the North Atlantic route and going to Halifax, and this in a cycle of about 3 months every year. The next image will show you the layout of the Atlantic Quartier, and I want to show you the position of the fire we had on board. It is As you can see, there are some twin decks up here which can be used for cars in this manner or just on a way like this for lorries, for example. And the fire was in this area on the first deck underneath the upper deck, on the port side of the ship, about in this position, and above there were the base for the containers to handle them on board itself. The next two images will give you a view on the ship a few days after the fire, where the ship was offloaded, so you can see or get a feeling about the size of the ship and the shape itself and the design. Here you see the picture from the stern. You see the ramp, which was now laid down to enter the ship by lorries, for example, and to bring out the rolling goods. Well, at 8 o'clock, 2 minutes past 8 in the evening of the 1st of May, a car fire occurred in the twin deck underneath the upper deck, and it was reported by the crew, by the emergency numbers of the port. And the first line forces could see smoke at about amidship, close to the container bay 26. And at that time, the access was only possible via a gangway at the stern of the ship. The ramp for the loading process was still closed, and a first exploration of the first platoon leader confirmed the exhaust of smoke and coming out of deck fans and out of some hatches, escape hatches, on the port side of the ship. And the crew was already working. They had initiated, upon arrival of the first forces, cooling measures down there on deck with ship-owned hoses. And the ship's first officer was on site and was able to confirm that there was a car fire on the deck below where new cars were stored. And 20 minutes later, the alert level was raised and from the platoon leader because of the difficult situation and the size of the ship. So additional fire engines, the fireboat, regional fire commander was alerted. And on this image you can see the first phase, let me say, the first attack and the first exploration situation. To see members of the crew, they have done their laid out their own hoses. You see members from the fire service, additional hoses, and see the situation underneath the base where the containers were stored. And on this picture you can already see the smoke coming out of the hatches at the port side of the ship, and you see the cooling measures, and you see that the water is vaporizing on board the ship because of the temperature of the steel itself. So this was the situation when we arrived on the scene. In this first phase, the ship's command was not able to definitely name the location of all crew members and other persons on board, and due to the large extent of the vessel and the poor accessibility, the alert level again was increased, and using a turntable ladder at amidship from the quay, another access to the deck was installed. A water supply with hoses has been established. In parallel, another possible attack route was explored, and at that time the forces tried to get in the ship via these hatches, which are at the port side. You can go down here, and one deck deeper you can find the fire site, and they try to find hatches which are far away enough from the fire area itself, but so that there might be an access to the fire area itself. So for a second attack line, we tried to open the ramp to get an access from about 150 meters away. The fire and safety plan was handed over by the crew of the ship, and all the information about the load itself. And so we had all the informations in the command post for calculating the floating stability of the vessel at any time. The affected deck with the fire inside was secured by a fixed carbon dioxide fire extinguishing system, as I told you. And the use of this system has been agreed by the captain, but previously it is necessary to ensure that there are no people in the area to be flooded, and furthermore the closing condition must be confirmed as closed and checked, all potential openings and fire protection closures to be in place. And this was very difficult to handle in the situation, to make clear that nobody's inside the ship and that it is really closed. And to determine the completeness of the crew, the evacuation of the ship was initiated, and in order to realize the closing condition, in the affected deck, a slide door had to be closed hydraulically but manually on site. So the people had to go in with breathing apparatus in the smoke, 150 meters inside the ship, and to move a very huge slide door to close the deck and to initiate the extinguishing system. So firemen in mixed crews with breathing apparatus and specialized crew members went in and tried to proceed to go along the smoke-filled areas from the ramp at the stern to the affected area. And because of the fire, the intense of the fire below the deck, and on deck itself, the first deformations occurred, and the first surface temperature of the steel rose up to about 200 degrees centigrade. And after several explosions below the deck, with a brief flame exit from single deck fans and still a lot of smoke, the attempted attack via the escape hatches had to be cancelled, and the deck had to be cleared for safety reasons. The deck, the port side of the ship, and the load close to the fire area was constantly cooled, effectively using fireboats, 3 harbor trucks, and from the land side, a hydraulic platform with a 53-meter long hydraulic mast, just to cool it down. And for the land-based water supply, a second fireboat was ordered. And at about 10:30, the alert level was increased again up to the level 5, which is one of the highest level for these situations. And in the joint briefing in the command post between the fire service, the ship command, the terminal operation, the water police, and the harbor master, a potential offloading of the deck load was initiated parallel to the preparation of the closing conditions and the cooling measures. And background for this was the concern that it might be difficult because of the upcoming deformations, that the system of base where the containers are in, like these ones, the deformation might be later difficult or impossible to offload the ship. So we started at that time to do it as soon as possible to offload it in a precautionary manner. And for this offloading process, once again back, I want to show you this situation. These ethanol tank containers were directly located above the fire area. So it's quite interesting to see all these dangerous goods on board of the ship, and to make clear that we have a safe situation by offloading these things. That was a big concern in the first part of the incident command. Well, for the offloading process, we had a small problem. It is necessary, of course, to represent the entire logistic chain, from container cranes to trucks like van carriers, forklifts, up to the storing position. And because of a bank holiday-related business interruption on the terminal, there was no personnel available. So it was a job for the police to bring all these personnel together in a timely manner. And this is one of the lessons learned we have, that you have to have a 24-hour secure service of all emergency procedures that you are able to handle such situations as soon as possible. A first attempt to close the slide door below the deck, as you can see it on this picture. This has to be moved manually, hydraulically, of course, but on site manually. It was able, and it was necessary to go there, and it failed in the first time because of the high temperatures there and still a lot of smoke. And even if the surface temperature could be kept constant by cooling actions and ventilation, cooling actions were additionally necessary inside the vessel. And we did this with oscillating monitors on the one hand side and with the remote-controlled carriage-mounted fan you saw on the slide where the agenda was written on. And after clearing the closing condition, the release of the CO2, the carbon dioxide extinguishing system, from the control room and the storage tank on deck 4 has been done. And immediately after opening the valves, this area of the control room, there was an uncontrolled outbreak of CO2, so that the extinguishing system had to be stopped at once, and forces using breathing apparatus, like you can see on the slides, had to go in again and first to find the leakage in the system, to manage to close it, and then to start the system again. And the reason why there was a leakage was this flange where there was an opening inside. They had to fix it first, and then the system could be used properly. In a period of observation, whether the extinguishing system successfully worked in conjunction with the cooling measures on deck and on the sidewalls, the surface temperature was monitored via remote-controlled thermometers, and in parallel, the offloading process continued. And to prepare the final attack, to make sure that the fire is really out, after opening the slide door in the later part of the incident, it was necessary to make any kind of preparation, therefore, and precautionary, we ordered a so-called cold cutting system to be able to walk through some steel walls in the ship, like bulkheads, side panels, or the decks. But at the end of the day, it was not necessary to use it, but you can see a firefighting appliance going inside the ship. At the back, there was this cold cutting system to get close to the affected area, to be able to go through walls to reach the fire area itself. As the other aspect was that we tried to to deal with the cooling and fire extinguishing water. As long as it is only cooling water, it's clear water. But if it is in contact with the fire ground, it is, of course, environmental problem water. So we try to implement sandbag barriers, and the black water tanks of the ship were still filled because the ship was just coming in from the sea, and we could not use the tank itself, so we had to manage and prepare a system to get up the dirty water. But at the end, even that this was not necessary to use in this incident. About 8 hours after the beginning of the incident, the temperatures were decreasing so much that at about 4 o'clock in the morning, the slide door could be opened and the fire-affected area could be inspected. Overall, in this intermediate deck, 35 of 68 cars which were located there have been on fire. For handling this incident, 4 sections were established by the fire department. Section 1 was dealing with all the operations on the upper deck in the area of the fire, and including the safety and escape routes. Section 2 was handling all the measures at the end, the rear of the ship and inside the ship. Section 3 was dealing with all the ships on the water side, the tugs, the fireboats, and the cooling measures. And Section 4 was the coordination of the first partial and afterwards complete offloading of the deck cargo. And a liaison officer was constantly in contact with the ship's officers on the bridge, so all measures to secure the ship's stability, like pumping of ballast water during the offloading process, management of the mooring lines according to the tidal range of 3.50 meters, and the floating of the ship during the offloading process were coordinated in this way. Well, you can see on this picture, on the next day, part of the deck, you can see some of the deformations, and all this space got a little bit of moving, and the last containers we put out there, they had some difficulties, because if you have only a few degrees of change at the bottom of this pillow, at the top it's centimeters, and it makes difficulties to get out this container. So it was a very good and right decision to offload as quick as possible. The further specification of the dangerous cargo of the vessel itself, especially the presence of radioactive material of class 7 on this ship, causes some discussions in political and public media after the event itself. On board there have been 3 containers, 2 containers and 1 lorry with urane hexafluoride. The gross mass was about 20 tons, and the inventory, the radionuclear inventory, was about 10 kilogram of urine hexafluoride, and that makes about 7 kilogram of urane in different positions, about 10 to 15 meters close to the fireplace itself, some above on the deck load, and 1 lorry with containers, with transport containments, let me say, of urine hexafluoride, 2.5 decks below the fire, and we could not reach this during the fire time itself. So some slides at the end to show you the situation on board itself. You see the inspection phase. You see the cars installed these twin decks, very narrow spaces, nearly impossible to get through. You see the fire hoses. Everything's black from the smoke in here. And you see the difficulties for the troops going inside the forces, because this is the situation you found during the incident, but in a completely smoked area. So if you walk here, it's quite easy to fall down somewhere. You see different sizes, different levels of the decks in there. So it was very, very difficult to get through. And it was important to see that this situation, like open doors here, the open fire doors everywhere, the ship was prepared for offloading, for the offloading process at the next day. So that was in open condition all over the decks at that time. And here we can see the situation of the car fires inside the deck, underneath the upper deck. This is the storing situation again, and this is the result afterwards. Brand new cars, and about 35 of them has been on fire during this incident. Well, what are the lessons learned? The lessons learned says again that the large extent and the difficulties of accessibility creates the needs of very sophisticated logistics and safety management for the own personnel as well, for every actor which is close to the incident. And it is necessary at any time to have independent means of escape for operative forces. There was one phase during the incident where there have been some explosions underneath the deck and some fire coming out of the fans, so they have to evacuate the deck immediately. Therefore, you have to be prepared at any time. So different routes of escape for the own personnel has to be implemented if the boat is on the quay, as well as if you are on the sea with different ships where you can go in case of any kind of emergencies. The necessary and very helpful is a close cooperation of all involved actors, of course, especially the ship's command. There was a very close link to them, and the distribution of any relevant information and plans, like, for example, where is the cargo, the loading position, what kind of goods are in there, the fire and safety plans, to make sure how to handle this situation, how to implement the standard procedures on this definite situation on board. And from our point of view as the overall command in this incident, it is very important to have the operational command of every section, even the offloading process, even the terminal operation under fire brigade control in this incident phase, to make sure that all the links between the different sections of the incident can be made properly. And the coordination of all assisting vessels around the TAC on the section 3 of the command structure, this is done by the captain of the fireboat, so he is a fireman himself. He knows how to handle the situation under firefighting aspects, so he can coordinate the captains of the TACs and give them advice how to cool, where to cool, and how to handle the situation at all. As I told you, there was a bank holiday on the terminal, and we had no emergency procedures to keep the system running 24/7 during all the time in case of any emergencies. So one of the lessons learned is to make sure that everywhere in the port, critical infrastructure and emergency procedures can be run 24/7 all over the year, to make sure that it is available in a timely manner. And the use of long-term breathing apparatus, the long distances, the high temperature, and the going into the ship in mixed teams requires a high standard of BA control and safety management. And it was very, very helpful to have local special forces in the fire service which are trained for ship firefighting and emergency medical service on board of ships. And this is very essential for safe work and efficient work. And as a State Fire Department of Hamburg, we run 5 platoons which are special trained just for ship firefighting and medical advice on boards of ships. And we do this in cooperation in the central command of maritime incidences along the coastline. They all have the same training, they all have the same material they're working with. So it's very helpful to have these forces for the commanders, the incident commander, to get advice, and to have the forces inside the ship who knows the ship itself, who knows how to handle different installations on board, and are firemen on the other hand side. And the use of the installed firefighting system in combination with a massive cooling procedure, that leads to the success in this area, but therefore it is necessary that the installed systems are available. And we've lost about, let me say, 3/4 of an hour during this incident to keep the system running. So one of the lessons learned is that it is necessary anywhere in the world, in any port, that the incoming ships have to be checked, and the system has to be proven if they are working regularly, because in case of any kind of emergency, especially if the ship is on the sea somewhere, it has to work at once, so it must be checked regularly at any time. So special equipment is essential, like the fireboats, the high-rise hydraulic mast. We use the water monitors, the cooling system, remote controlled, the cameras with thermal images that you can see how the temperature is going all over the board, walls, so that you know exactly about the situation, if it is stable, if it is increasing, decreasing, if you are successful with all the measures you have implemented. And we had lots of problems with opening fire doors and smoke doors. You saw the pictures at the end of the presentation where there were gaps in the decks and open doors. So if it is necessary to open doors for the loading process, of course it is. Just do it close to the loading process itself, not hours before. And another aspect, especially from my point of view in the city of Hamburg, is that the information management, the public media, has to be clear with the responsibilities of the terminal operators and the shipping companies, because it was very sensitive if you have nuclear material, for example, inside the city center, close to a mass event. And this causes weeks of discussions afterwards if it was correctly given this information. We as a fire service, we are working on in the terminal area on private property. And the terminal operation company, he's responsible for any kind of public information about this. And we have advised them, give this information, make it open, make it transparent, make it clear. They didn't. And so we could only say there has been hazardous material on board, because there was no impact outside of the fence of the terminal, let me say. So this was an aspect which has to be cleared for future events as well. Well, I thank you very much for your listening, and thank you very much for the invitation. So I'm listening to your questions, please.
نشكر السيد كلوس. طبعا نحن من خلال برنامج المؤتمر سوف تكون هناك جلسة نقاش مفتوحة، وجميع المتحدثين في جلسة النقاش بيشاركون، فرجاء كتابة الأسئلة للمتحدثين. اسمحوا لي أن أستقبل على المنصة زميلي أندي دين سيشاركني في تقديم المحاضرين. أندي دين سوف تكون له فقرة إعطاء ملخص أو إيجاز عن كل متحدث لمدة 3 دقائق. نعرف بأندي دين. طبعا أندي دين لديه خبرة 25 سنة في مجال السلامة في الأبنية، وبالتحديد التكسير الخارجي والسلامة من الحريق. طبعا هو كان عضو فاعل لدينا في القيادة العامة للدفاع المدني. شارك القيادة بإعطاء بيانات لإعداد كود الإمارات. أندي please come to the stage.
Many thanks, Lieutenant Colonel. Thank you. Yeah, obviously it's not my job to repeat what you've just heard, but I wanted to kind of bring to the surface a couple of thoughts to share, perhaps with the audience, that I thought were really kind of came out very strongly from there. Clearly, there was a difficult incident. There was compartmentation issues. Obviously, we had that compartmentation issue with having to have absolutely critical parts of the ship manually closed, which required manual access in there. And, you know, with a degree of foresight, an automation of that door could have been implemented. Lots of lessons learned. Obviously, Klaus identified all the lessons learned and summed that up very carefully. But there was clearly lots of issues that had to be dealt with, that had to be managed. The CO2 system, the management of the containment, the contaminated water potentially. I thought that it was fascinating that one of the decisions taken was actually to unload the ship. Now that's quite a bold move, I think, when you're trying to deal with all of the other aspects. Now some of that was absolutely necessary, clearly from moving the potentially dangerous material and explosive material, but it's also quite a time-consuming aspect. So actually the decision taken early, and that's the key, I think, to this, make that kind of a decision early in terms of moving that amount of material, I think was particularly critical. But one of the strong themes that came out of this, and I think that this, from reading the summaries of the presentations, I think this is a theme that's going to come out very strongly throughout the series today, is preparedness and coordination. And in particular, one of the aspects that came out that I thought was particularly interesting was the coordination with the private sector, the ship itself, the port. In spite of there being issues with the operation of things like the CO2 system, I thought that that was really key. I think that sometimes with forces, there's an expectation to stand back and let them do the work, but I would imagine that mapping routes through the ship and getting access and knowing where all the hatches were was absolutely key to the extinguishing of this fire. So thanks again, Klaus, for a fascinating journey through this reaction to this fire and giving his insights. Thank you.